Great. Okay,
Like,
so today we're on Hegel's philosophy of nature, physics, subsection 325, and he says the particularization of the individual body does not stop at an inert uh, diversity of properties and their own separate activities, from which, in the electrical process, the abstract pure selfhood of body, the light principle, first issues in the tension of opposed moments and then resolves the latter in their indifference. Since the particular properties are only the reality of this simple notion, the body of their soul of light, and since the complex of the properties, the particular body is not truly independent, the entire corporeality therefore enters into tension, into a process which is at the same time the becoming of the individual body. Shape, which at first only proceeded from the notion, and therefore was posited only in principle, an sich, now issues from an existent process and presents itself as the posited outcome of an existence, the chemical process. So, what does all that mean? The parts of the process that have been posited up to now are being shown as a specific process that brings a body made up of those processes into being. And uh, so we have the chemical process. Um, yeah.
yeah, so
So
we've gotten past shape as a whole. Now we find it yet again dissolves toward process and the chemical process, which will, I guess, will refine shape yet again.
yeah. And remember, it's the logical order
Yeah.
of these things. And so it gives you the illusion that very complex things um say result from simpler uh elements when in fact he's detailing the already existent complex processes by breaking them down logically. Fr from the most abstract to the concrete, same as any of his other studies. Um, yeah, it's one of those it's one of those it's it's one of those common misconceptions, even among writers on Hegel and Marx, that Hegel and Marx can't possibly have started from the premise, at least, uh, at least implicitly, that the process was already one that was fully realized. Um, but that's exactly what it is. Marx went and studied capitalism, a process of economic reality that already existed. But he studied it in such a way that he didn't start with the whole and then break down the parts. He studied the whole, looked at all the parts and said, how do these logically fit together from the most abstract idea all the way up until the most detailed processes that are part of it. Um, and even at that level, the study is more of a pseudo logical study because capitalism in and of itself is not a an all-encompassing totality. You know what I mean? Um, it exists in a world in which it affects things, but it isn't the full whole reality, I guess you could say. At Hegel's level here, when he looks at nature, you know, and he looks at the human process, we're talking about all of reality. So that's a bit bigger than Marx's study, I guess you could say. So the chemical process, 326, it says, in individuality developed into a totality, The moments themselves are determined as individual totalities, as whole particular bodies, which at the same time are in relation only as different towards each other. This relation as the identity of non-identical independent bodies is contradiction and hence is essentially process, the function of which, in conformity with the notion, is the positing of the differentiated as identical, the removal of difference and the differentiation of the identical, the enlivening and disassociation of it. Okay. What's going on there, Kyle?
Say it again. Sorry.
Oh, I just read 326.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, like this is again where we had before in essence where the contradiction leads basically is the engine that moves it forward basically. It's toward a resolutions on this say it's a contradiction say in the sense between alkaline and a base does eventually lead to a process. So their relationship is non-identical in the sense it's also not stable. So it moves itself forward toward a resolution. So it's a pausing differentiate as identical, the removal of the difference so that they react. In the differentiation identical or the enlivening disassociation of it, the original things are now basically they end up dissolving, becoming something else.
yeah,
And so it is, I'd say, yet a much higher conception of what a process is.
yeah. Chemical process is the third stage in the process of shape. The second was differentiating shape in its abstract process, electricity. We also had a process in shape before it achieved completeness and neutrality, namely magnetism. If shape is the unity, okay, here we're getting into the syllogism, I think.
Mhm.
If shape is the unity of notion and reality, then magnetism, as at first only abstract activity, is the notion of shape, the second stage, the particularization of shape within itself and against an other is electricity. The third stage is the self-realizing unrest of the chemical process as the veritable reality of the notion in this sphere. Okay, that seems like a
Yeah, but also, I
pretty
guess, just
important.
interesting thing that kind of defines shape a lot more too, because in magnetism, shape is just sort of that kind of force abstractly there.
Yeah,
Electricity kind of shows the cohesion itself, how it holds, and then chemistry is essentially what makes that shape stable because, of course, that shape can go through many different processes. Of course, projecting that toward life is the very nature of the chemical process that maintains shape.
yeah. Let's see here. Chemical process is the totality of the life of inorganic individuality, for here we have whole physically determined shapes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Bodies enter into the process not merely as having odor, taste, and color, but as being odorous matter, tasting, and colored matter. Their relation is not one of movement, but of alteration of the entire different matters, the vanishing of their distinctive characteristics.
Yeah, I guess it was in the sense of process not merely having odor, so it's just an identity that has a property. It
Hmm.
is the very nature of this movement that it is being that matter.
Yeah,
And so that matter, because it's, I guess, a process, isn't necessarily isn't necessarily continuous.
Think a lot of it's related to the differences between, like, say, a mixture versus a compound.
Yeah.
Mixture, the properties of a mixture are reducible to the properties of its components. Whereas with a compound like water is a compound of hydrogen and oxygen, but the properties of water are not obviously reducible to the properties of either oxygen or of hydrogen or a mixture of to leave either. So it's something water has properties that just are distinct from the properties of either oxygen or hydrogen.
Okay, this is interesting. So he says the chemical process is the unity of magnetism and electricity, which are the abstract formal sides of this totality and are for that reason not the same process. Every chemical process contains magnetism and electricity in principle, but they cannot appear in their distinctiveness in the, so to speak, saturated course of the process. They can do so only when the chemical process is itself an abstract manifestation, when it does not attain its full reality. This is so in the universal individuality of the earth. The fully realized chemical process is the universal process of the earth, but we must distinguish between the process of the individuality proper and the universal individuality. Hmm. So it's like the whole earth versus things on earth.
It's almost more like it's in a more literal sense, the particular versus universal in a way too, because like this chemistry happens here versus this is sort of the process as a whole that continues. Like the particular, like you end up having a reaction and an end product. But for me, it almost seems like the end product that's the end versus the universal would be the fact that that process will continue. Is that
So it's like the law of how the world works versus the world itself working.
right? It's the abstract versus the concrete.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And differentiating the universal from the particular is more of an idea space thing versus the actual process, which is all at once, all together. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
Like he says, the chemical process in general contains electricity, but you can't see electricity like individuality, individualized, separate from the chemical process, unless you were running an experiment, right? And you identified the particularization as this, here's the electrical current in the atmosphere. Uh, I'm kind of losing that metaphor because I mean, can you really vacuum seal the magnetism or the electricity away from the full chemical process? I don't think you can. I think you just control for the environment so that you can identify the particularization,
Yeah, I
right?
think it's more like the moments and how they interact.
Right, right. And scientific experiments usually deal with moments versus trying to see the whole based on, religious dogma, text, I don't know. It's fascinating. Um, as a universal individuality, Earth endures and does not therefore enter into the chemical process which affects a whole shape, only insofar as its existence is not universal. Uh, that is, insofar as it divides itself into particular bodies, does it enter into chemical process? So basically, the only way we can track chemical process is, you know, by looking at the Earth, at parts of the Earth, not the whole.
And the chemistry of the earth then is what we've seen as the and seen the meteorological process to be. The process of physical elements as universally determined matters, which are not yet individual corporealities. Since the chemical process is here thus abstractly, its abstract moments come to view here too. So on the Earth, consequently, that which has alteration outside of it, that magnetism takes its appearance, and likewise the electric tension of the thunderstorm. Electricity of Earth, which includes lightning, northern lights, etc., however, differs in kind from ordinary electricity as it is not tied to the same conditions. Magnetism and electricity are merely born by the chemical process. It is through the universal process of Earth that they themselves are first posited. The universal is like the more abstract level, right?
Yep.
Hmm.
Yeah, you're talking about like the at this level of differentiation between the particular and the universal, you're talking about the laws
Right.
that govern whatever happens in the particular world. And so, it's when you're looking at the universal level, you can't just say, "Oh, there's the universal. It's doing its thing, blah blah blah." No, you look at a particular thing that's doing something according to
Right.
laws. Those laws are how the world works, but it's also reflected in your head if you know how the world works as a set of laws that we've set down um, through observing particular processes and then collating them as common to them all. And even that universal is subject, as we know, to scientific uh, revision. Yeah,
We always test the validity of universal principles against the behavior of particulars.
yeah,
I mean, there is a
yeah, exactly.
dialectic between formulating universals and testing them against particulars, then modifying universals uh, depending on what you observe from the particulars.
Yeah, and one of the problems with some of the more rigid versions of communism, Marxism, whatever you want to call it, is one of the greatest mistakes to be made along that line is to turn any of the universals in Marxism into rigid laws that do not change. What you're basically saying is that uh, the world won't move on, the world won't change, and so these will always be the case. Of course, we know that not to be true, to be utterly bogus. Um, Stalin's regime definitely tried to treat Marxism as if it was a dogma, for instance. But it was contradictory because the way it worked was on the one hand in the literature, it certainly looked like that. On another level, Stalin wanted to move on from Lenin and Trotsky's revolutionary internationalism to a nationalist, um, almost conservatism.
Yeah, I mean the slogan "socialism is one country" actually took that from Bukharin. So
Yeah.
Jim.
But here, when we're talking about the philosophy of nature, the universals that make up the earth, Hegel is trying his best to only identify what is universal based off of what I'm not going to say is not subject to change because it certainly is. Um, I'm getting further from the text thinking about this, honestly. Because, like, will our picture of the universal that is the whole earth change? Yeah, based on our observation of the particular. But here I think he's tried to keep it as simple as possible. And so you've got magnetism, electricity, and the chemical process. Sorry, my I'm wandering.
Well, we know that's the case because our understanding of electricity and magnetism have changed quite a bit since Hegel's day.
Yeah.
And the science has developed. Even a few decades after Hegel's death, there was big changes in the scientific understanding of electricity and magnetism.
I feel like I've read this before. He says the difference of the philosophically systematic mode of treatment from the empirical is that it does not treat levels of concrete existences in nature as totalities, but as levels of character determinations. Thus,
He
when we,
does tend
oh,
to
go ahead.
repeat himself on these comments as they come back up. So
Yeah, no, I know. He says, thus, when we have first considered the Earth as a planet, its concrete nature has not been exhausted. A further determination of physical moments is, on the contrary, a further determination of Earth, so far as such determinations are proper to Earth as a universal individuality. For the finite relationships of individual bodies do not concern Earth. This is precisely the case with the relationships here. The hierarchy of these relationships and their interrelatedness is one thing, but the consideration of a concrete individual body as such is another.
right.
Okay. All
So
right.
like yeah, the
It's happening again. So we talk for 15 minutes about something, go on to the next paragraph, and it's
yeah
like he heard us.
the ex
Jesus.
again we're back to the experiments in the lab, not necessarily to find the entire Earth
Yeah.
process, even though it can be a particular that leads toward that points to the universal.
Yeah.
Ow.
Exactly. The individual body unites all these determinations within itself and is like a bouquet in which they are bound together. To apply these observations to the present case, Earth as a self-subsistent individuality opposed to the Sun does in fact exhibit chemical process, but only as a process of elements. At the same time, the chemical process of Earth is to be grasped only as a past process. For these giant members, enjoying a separate and independent existence, remain at the stage of diremption, not passing over into neutrality. On the other hand, process as it comes to view in particular corporeal individualities brings about their reduction to neutral existences which can be taken apart again. This process is inferior to the universal process. We are restricted to it, whereas the meteorological process is the great chemistry of nature. But on the other hand, it ranks higher since it immediately precedes the vital process. For in the latter, no member can endure or exist as a part, but endures only in the subjective unity. And it is the subjective unity which is the actuality of the vital process. So he's differentiating individual bodies to the full process that precedes the individual bodies. Blah, blah, blah. The process of the heavenly bodies is, on the other hand, still abstract since they remain in their independence. The individual chemical process, therefore, is deeper since in it the truth of particular bodies becomes actual, namely, that they seek and attain their unity. So it's sort of like the way he's writing it out here, you could almost like, you know how you like zoom in or zoom out on the scale of the universe, and you're trying to figure out how things work. The the range that he talks about of the earth and the other heavenly bodies is a different range set from, say, you know, the meadow, and how we treat each setting. They're at different ranges, right? We can't treat one range just like the other. Um, because, when we're looking at the meadow, we sort of treat the galaxy as a given, right? We're not trying to determine the nature of the galaxy when we look at the meadow.
In order to make an apple pie, first you must create the universe.
Yeah, exactly. And if you're looking and if you try to force it, the only thing you can really say about the galaxy is a set of very abstract concepts, much more abstract than the meadow in front of you. And so the terms are not alike. You know what I mean? Like the way light acts in interstellar space is a very different conversation from looking at the meadow and seeing how the light reflects off the grass,
Hmm.
you know, um, because you could feel the warmth. You could, it interacts with yourself and the animals around you, and then there's the light in interstellar space that reflects processes that are relevant to the meadow, but not immediately.
Oh God, I was just thinking that also would be like the closest thing to cold light that Hegel talks about, right?
Mhm.
Light in space.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Light is cold in space. On Earth, we call light warm because with light usually comes warmth because
Plus it's
yeah,
got
yeah.
more to interact with too.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I think here he's giving us a sort of like a couple lines on why the level of abstraction is important to keep in mind when doing discussions like this because if you're bringing in terms that are mixed from very abstract to the very concrete and applying it all to the same thing willy-nilly, I mean, logic breaks down
Yeah. This
the
is
logic of your discussion.
It's the position of the chemical process in the whole. We must distinguish it in process of the elements in a particular process, simply because particular bodies are not only particular but also belong to universal elements.
Fuck, he's doing it again. Yeah. Yes. We must distinguish it in it, the process of the elements in the particular process, simply because particular bodies are not particular, but belong also to the universal elements. God. Consequently, when
Consequently, in the process of particular bodies, the universal particular process must also manifest in them simply because it is the universal process.
another way of saying it is that the universal process is is sublated already in the particular process. Yeah, because if you think about it, the further in here we go, we get to the life process. The life process already has light, magnetism, chemical process, sublated as earlier terms in it. But also, if you think of the natural way that life works, those are sublated processes in the life
And
process.
you throw that back to the logic, same thing there too.
Yes, exactly. Which is another way that the philosophy of nature helps illuminate the science of logic. It's fascinating because you get through this, especially the essential section, and then you can go back to the doctrine of essence, and you know, you'll probably get it a lot easier. Not that I'm looking to do that anytime soon, but maybe it might be a good idea. Who
There
knows?
was a big discussion among 19th century Hegel commentators about the relationship between the philosophy of nature and the science of logic.
Really?
I mean, there were some people who thought that everything was supposed to be, match up one to one, but it's not quite true. And basically, Hegel said it was not true,
On
but
on
Hegel was willing to allow it. There is certainly a parallelism between the two works.
Yeah,
Yeah.
on a schematic level, I would agree with them,
Yeah,
but I think the key is that if if you look at the schematic of the science of logic, and you've got being, you've got essence, and then you've got notion. Okay. And then you're looking at another one of these books of Hegel's, and the general schematic follows the same pattern in which, okay, here we're in the essential section of the nature, right? Yes, you can parallel them, but
Yeah.
only at that schematic level. If
Yeah.
you try to get more particular than that, trying to match, chemical process to wherever we are in the doctrine of essence and the logic, and try to like do some numerology or something, uh, that's when you're going to get confused, especially since if you think about it, the science of logic, the philosophy of nature, and the philosophy of life or mind, right, are different levels of abstraction in a syllogism. Okay. And if you're going syllogistically, um, the logic the logic ends in the notion, right? The notion is taken up as sublated in the nature. So every element or category in the nature, if you think about it, has the sublated full notion sublated into it. If you're trying to match one to one of the problems you'll run into is if you read the nature into the logic in a bad way, then at a certain level, you assumed that what's already built and sublated in nature, exists sublated in the logic before you've finished the end of the logic. You know what I mean?
It's presuppose, not whatever the other word is.
Post supposed
Yeah, suppose
or
like
so,
it's I
like
forget it's another P word that Hegel likes to use to point backwards.
like like
Point
you could
forwards, I mean.
like in general you can draw a line between the essential sections of all three books. But if you try to point the arrow backwards, it, I know I'm repeating myself, but what exists as sublated in the nature does not exist as fully sublated in the logic until the very end of the logic.
Yeah, right. It's only presupposed in nature's only presupposed in logic in the sense that it naturally leads to nature. Gets posited is the other direction. The logic posits nature
Y-
in the very
Yeah.
vague sense that he uses it in that way. It's
Yeah.
just that it's logically down the line versus presupposed, which is or which is the
I'm not
uh,
disagreeing with you.
yeah,
I'm not disagreeing with you.
right.
It's
Trying to
more like
find the detail,
I'm
the nuance.
I
Yeah, I get
no,
it.
no. I'm just trying to remember if
Oh,
I'm using the term correctly or if I'm even understanding it correctly. So like hang on. So logic does logic presuppose nature or I think nature presupposes
yeah.
wait.
Presupposes backwards from concrete to abstract. Posited is abstract to concrete.
Okay. All right.
So
So
they're just
so
inverses.
the logical order is the positing. So it's like
Yeah,
Marx's capital. He posits the capitalist system from the abstract commodity,
correct.
right? Is that a correct statement?
Yes.
Okay.
I
If
took
if
me a bit to
if
recall. Ooh,
yeah, if you say presuppose, capitalism presupposes the commodity as an existing system. I'm trying to think of another way to put this because if you say that capitalism presupposes the commodity that takes its shape from capitalism, you're basically talking about the historical order. And right? And the historical order is um it's acknowledged by Hegel when he says that nature presupposes man and logic that is
It's your positive.
is written down by man, but
Oh.
but if you're doing it in the positing order, you reverse it, and you have science of logic, nature. It's a study.
Mm.
The positing order that he uses is for the scientific study. Uh, Presupposition indicates history. See, this is one of those things about Marxism and how they have the two terms historical. They they have historical materialism, and then they have dialectical materialism. And so my question based on all of this, and it's a real question. If I say dialectical materialism, am I talking about the positing order, and then the historical materialism is the presupposition order?
Well,
Is that a
there's
correct statement?
no, because there's logical. Remember, the same thing here is of the natural logical order versus the empirical order.
Okay.
That's kind of the same thing. History is an empirical order more than a logical.
Right.
Okay, so they're technically logical. The logical and empirical can overlap, but it's not necessary. They're parallel tracks again.
Right. Marx somewhere in
Hmm.
Capital or in one of the prefaces talks about the order of presentation um, of his book. And the order of presentation that he made was basically somewhat like Hegel, at least in the schematic chapter, where you posit the commodity and the commodity posits
Uh,
the labor
yeah,
as a dual character thing, so
it's
on and
like
so forth.
oh, yeah, Hegel's always from abstract through negation to the concrete because negation is just determinacy.
Right. But
And so that's historical doesn't necessarily arrive that direction because it can make connections without the detail and then those details fill in.
yeah, yeah. So these are questions that I have when going over this stuff. Like,
Yeah, I think in the Stalinist conception, the idea was dialectical materialism was the more universal understanding,
Yeah,
because dialectical materialism applies not only to history but also to nature and to universe as a whole, whereas historical materialism applies to human history. So
hmm.
was a particularization of dialectical materialism.
So dialectical materialism was like the law, and historical materialism dealt with the unfolding of history.
Yeah,
Yeah, like you
right.
said. Okay.
but you have to be careful because Stalin had one understanding of the relationship between the two. And other Marxist traditions have had different understandings of that.
Yeah. And one thing about Marx, he wasn't afraid to revise his universals, whereas Stalin said that they were ironclad to protect the Russian state, so on and so forth. Um, you know, uh, you know, uh, Exhibit A was the revision of the Communist Manifesto after the French after the Paris Commune was slaughtered, and then they revised it. You said that you can't just take over the state
Daddy,
and use it for class purposes for a different class when it was built for the bourgeoisie. Yes, honey.
pepperoni.
No.
That's for pizza.
You want some pepperoni?
Yes.
All right. I'll be right back. Uh, uh, yeah. I'll be right back. We're
Okay.
almost done.
Yeah.
Yeah, in the Soviet Union, I mean, Marxism was meant to be a kind of science of history as opposed to ideology. Marx drew a distinction between science and ideology, but in the Soviet state, Marxism becomes an ideology as well, because it was used to rationalize the practices of the Soviet state.
Oh man, there's so much about Soviet Union history I don't really know.
Or I would say I'm weak on is understanding, say, Chinese history of Chinese Marxism.
Well, and I'll
Or,
just say
I mean, I read Mao, but
my understanding about history in general about either of those is still nothing compared to what you've read. So there's so much I've read. I'm just thinking ahead. Hey, there's a project. Read more about that. Something the kind that's been oh, and we forgot to do remote control, but we're almost done anyways. Something that kind of helps observe the chemical process. There is, however, in any chemical process, termination of the universal elements for this particular formations are only subjectivized forms of the universal elements, which still stand in relation to them. Therefore, particular qualities are altered in the chemical process. This also involves the determining of the universal elements. Water essentially a condition or a product. Fire, similarly, is a cause or an effect. Yeah, because it's a process, right?
All right. Um, we're coming to the end of this section. As in this way, can you hear me all right?
Mm-hmm.
As in this way, the notion of the chemical process is in general to be totality. We have to think of the notion as wholly immanent in its differences, i.e., in positing itself as the negative of itself, it remains quite at home with itself. Each side, therefore, is the whole. As one side of the process, the acid is, of course, not what the alkali is, and vice versa. Both are thus one-sided, but the further point is that each side is also in itself the other, the totality of itself in the other. This is the thirst of the alkali for the acid, and conversely. Interesting. The moment the bodies are activated, begeist it. They seize hold of each other. If they can find nothing better, they enter into process with the air. That each is in itself the other is demonstrated by each seeking the other. Each is therefore the contradiction of itself, but everything only has an impulse insofar as it is this self-contradiction. So he's describing what the chemical process is and does by looking at the constituents in the chemical process and the fact that the whole of the chemical process cannot be itself without those differentiating elements resolving, right? Yeah, that makes sense. Process can't be what it is without its parts. This first begins in the chemical process, for here this contradiction of being in itself neutral, in itself the whole, brings about the infinite urge. In life, this is further brought to view. The chemical process is thus an analog of life, the inner restlessness of life. There before our eyes may astonish us. If the chemical process could carry itself on spontaneously, it would be life. This explains our tendency to see life in terms of chemistry. Yeah,
Yeah, it's also
I mean, yeah,
about some of those chemical processes that have this sort of oscillatory back and forth to them that seem more lifelike.
yeah,
That astounds some people. And it's like it's well, yeah, that's because it's kind of a precursor.
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, we mentioned,
Yeah.
talked about crystals, relation between crystals and life. And that's actually an idea that's been revived in modern science. The idea there are certain theories of the origin of life that trace the origin of life back to crystals, because crystals already have some of the properties we associate with life.
yeah. But so like you can't say that because life is like crystals, crystals developed into life, that's not the case. However, if you look at some of the processes in crystals as positing what is going on in the chemical process in more complex life,
Yep.
then
Right.
that's a better observation to
That
make.
more something more fundamentally that's something more fundamental about them that makes it this the same and not the overlying process. Right.
Yeah.
There's a general shape that occurs through this that one is maintained through chemical process.
Yeah.
The other is just the result only.
Right. Exactly. And being able to point out the difference is I think an important part of scientific education, because so many times science itself is pa- bad science that, you know, gets it backwards is often passed off as real science. Yeah. Something like that. Okay. So, um awesome. So we're at 236. Where did we say we go before? We said we work
I
through
think
232 to 244. So can we just say 236 through 244 for next time?
yes, yeah, I was going to say the same thing.
Yeah. And we'll read that, come back and discuss it, and hopefully uh graduate graduate on into life pretty soon.
All right.
All right. It's great to see you, comrades.